After 2 mediocre seasons, at this point there's no denying that The Rings of Power has failed to live up to the legacy of the original trilogy. Its first season was kept on life support by the mystery surrounding Sauron's identity, but in season 2 the schemes of blonde-weave Sauron just weren't enough to keep us hooked. Reviewer after reviewer, commentator after commentator have pointed the blame for this failure directly at the showrunners. But I think the story of The Rings of Power is far more tragic than most commentators suggest. It's much more a tale of showrunners being given an almost impossible task to complete and predictably failing.
Goodbye, Grand Elf.
Than that of an incompetent production. And the almost inevitability of the series' decline is what I want to focus on in this video. Our story begins with the success of Peter Jackson's legendary film trilogy. From the release of its first entry, Fellowship of the Ring, the series instantly set the bar not just for fantasy, but cinematic adaptations as a whole, and would go from strength to strength with each new entry, in the end bringing in over $3 billion and establishing Lord of the Rings as a global IP. But it also created a massive problem for any adaptations of Tolkien going forward. You see, it was so faithful to Tolkien's adaptation that it created an almost impossible standard to follow. As I explained in great detail in a previous video on The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's masterpiece is so distinct and unique, despite lacking a lot of the nuance and sophistication of modern fantasy, because it expertly draws from a 200-year-old artistic tradition known as Romanticism. As the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states, in reference to the artistic movement, the most characteristic romantic commitment is to the idea that the character of art and beauty and of our engagement with them should shape all aspects of human life, and reverence of aesthetic beauty. Now, to put it simply, romantics equate beauty with moral purity, and a lack of beauty with moral corruption, specifically the beauty contained within the harmony between the natural world and humanity. Now, if you haven't picked up yet already, this almost describes the Lord of the Rings books, and by extension Peter Jackson's thematically faithful adaptation to a T. The central narrative conflict in Lord of the Rings is not just between good and evil, but between aesthetic beauty and its opposite. Saruman and Sauron's armies are full of ugly, depraved creatures, and their spread brings about devastation to the natural beauty of the environment. And those who fall under the influence of Sauron or the Ring, like Gollum and the King of the Rohirrim, suffer rot in body as well as in mind. And on the flip side, all of the moral, noble and good races embody the romantic aesthetic ideal. The elves literally glow with beauty and live in harmony with the environment in sustainable enclaves. And the hobbits, the race regarded by the Fellowship and many in Middle-earth as the purest and most unvarnished, not only live harmoniously with the environment, but, as Tolkien himself stated, are most similar to him. To expect another director to emulate this perfect representation of Tolkien's vision is an almost impossible ask. It's not just as simple as try and copy Peter Jackson. Lord of the Rings was a one-in-a-century event established under very specific conditions by a very specific team with a very specific vision. So to avoid their adaptation seeming like an inferior version of Peter Jackson's, any new director or showrunner is forced to go in a different direction. And for a generation of writers and showrunners weaned on HBO as the gold standard for TV writing, it's no surprise their first instinct is to add a level of nuance that just doesn't fit in the Tolkien verse. When a modern writer sees a dark lord who wants to dominate, they add tears, or a demonic creature of pure malice, they add family values. Now, ordinarily this wouldn't be a problem, but because this is Tolkien and his vision is so uniquely unadapted for this, an adaptation of his works can't completely shift towards a modern interpretation without depriving the series of its core identity. This is why in The Rings of Power, the showrunners adopted a weird middle ground that satisfied no one in the end. They knew they couldn't compete with Jackson's vision without seeming inferior by comparison, so they added a level of modernity. But they also knew they couldn't completely veer away from his interpretation because it's the gold standard for Tolkien. And so they ended up in a situation where their show wasn't sophisticated enough to compete with Game of Thrones or its spin-off because it didn't delve deeply enough into modern styles of writing, political drama. At the same time, it wasn't Tolkien enough for its romantic scenes to seem anything but a poor TV budget imitation Peter Jackson's gold standard. And this is the tragedy of Rings of Power. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't get anything right and it doesn't capture an ounce of Tolkien. The War of the Jewels montage in particular stands out and something I find myself continually watching over and over again. Maybe I have a hope that this somehow transforms into the entire series, who knows? But for the most part, the locations, character stories, and set pieces of the series simply fail to scratch that Tolkien itch nor satisfy a modern audience. The presentation of the elves in Lord of the Rings versus Rings of Power is a perfect example of this. On paper, the elves in these scenes are not fundamentally different. They both live in grand fantasy realms, both dress in elaborate embroideries, and both have pointy ears. But one set are infinitely more iconic and fascinating to observe than the other. The elves of Lothlorien seem like they burst to life from a portrait of a mysterious fantasy realm. The almost eerie yet strikingly beautiful uniformity of the glowing elves intertwining with their natural environment, like a hive mind, invokes an image so distinct that it's hard to forget after and take your eyes off during. The elves of Eregion, by contrast, seem strikingly familiar and human-like. Gone is the unique, ethereal, almost hive-like mind uniformity in place of human-like diversity of outfits, haircuts, and professions. Now on paper, making elven civilization more like ours will allow us to resonate with them. But when you have a narrative peppered with lines about the great enemy Morgoth, or Sauron, or the Force of Light, it creates a strange disconnect when you have human-like characters saying these lines. And the same applies to the city itself. Eregion looks like a nice place to visit, but it completely lacks the almost ethereal beauty that made Lothlorien and Rivendell so iconic. But again, you can hardly blame the creators for any of these changes. To make lines about light and darkness in the age of men and elves seem epic rather than corny, and construct a fantasy world so iconic and beautiful that it hasn't been surpassed ever, took a stroke of brilliance in the 2000s that you can't expect a bunch of TV writers to achieve. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and let me know in the comments if you think Rings of Power ever had a chance.